Hello, and welcome to Mind Sherlock, where every story feels like a conversation over a warm cup of coffee. Today, I bring you a brand new Sherlock Holmes mystery, filled with twists, clues, and clever deductions. Make yourself comfortable, and let's unravel the case together. And if you'd like, leave a quick comment and tell me where you're joining from. It's always a pleasure to know where our little detective community is tuning in from. Now, let's get started. It is a singular trait of Sherlock Holmes that he finds the greatest delight in the impossible. Many cases of high renown had passed through our sitting room at 221 B. Baker Street. Cases of murder most foul, of thefts executed with fiendish precision, of secrets buried beneath layers of deception. But the matter of the Bank of England robbery was unlike any other. Even as I recount it now, I find it strains credulity, though the facts remain unshakable. The case came to my attention one dreary November afternoon as I sat opposite Holmes by the fire, absorbed in the pages of the Times. He had been silent for the better part of an hour, lounging in his dressing gown with fingers steepled beneath his chin, his eyes half closed in that peculiar state of thought which to an untrained observer might resemble indolence. "I presume, Watson, that you have glanced at the reports of the so-called invisible robbery," he remarked suddenly, without opening his eyes. I started. Invisible robbery? I cannot say I have encountered such a phrase. He reached for the newspaper upon my lap and, with a faint smile, tapped at a column buried beneath the more sensational headlines. £50,000 in gold and banknotes vanished without a trace from a vault locked from the inside, he mused. No forced entry, no disturbances, no witnesses, and yet the money is gone. I scanned the brief report, my mind struggling to grasp the implications. Surely there is some rational explanation, an oversight, an internal miscalculation. Holmes's eyes gleamed with amusement. That, Watson, is what we shall soon determine. I expect our visitor within the next few minutes. No sooner had he spoken than our bell gave a sharp ring, followed by the sound of hurried footsteps upon the stairs. A moment later, Mrs. Hudson ushered in a gentleman of distinguished yet dishevelled appearance. His grey hair was ruffled, his cravat loosened as though he had dressed in haste, and the deep furrows upon his brow betrayed a mind tormented by pressing anxieties. "Mr. Archibald Forster, I presume," Holmes said, rising from his chair with the air of one greeting an anticipated guest. The man gave a start. "Why, yes. You know me, sir." Holmes gestured toward the papers upon the table. "Your name appears in the reports of the Bank of England robbery, though your presence here is its own form of introduction. A man does not seek out Sherlock Holmes unless he is faced with a problem of the most perplexing nature. Pray, be seated and tell us everything." Forster sank into the armchair opposite Holmes, drawing a handkerchief from his coat pocket to dab at his forehead. "I am the Director of Security for the Bank of England," he began, his voice tight with strain. "2 nights ago, our staff conducted a routine audit of the vaults. Everything was in perfect order. But when the morning shift arrived..." He hesitated, swallowing hard. "The gold was gone. £50,000 in notes and bars. Vanished." Holmes nodded. "No forced entry, no disturbances, and no one unaccounted for." Forster exhaled sharply. "Precisely. The vault was sealed. The guards reported nothing unusual. The locks were intact, the security measures unbreached. And yet, the gold is gone. Scotland Yard insists it must have been an inside job. But I tell you, Mr. Holmes, every man in that building has been scrutinised. None had the opportunity, and all have alibis. It is as if the money simply ceased to exist. Holmes tapped his fingers together, his expression unreadable. And yet, my dear sir, such things do not happen. There is always a cause, however imperceptible it may seem at first glance. Forster leaned forward, desperation in his eyes. Then you will take the case. A slow smile crossed Holmes's face as he reached for his pipe. My dear Watson, I believe we have just been presented with a most fascinating puzzle. Forster leaned forward, his fingers gripping the arms of his chair as though to steady himself. It is, Mr. Holmes, as if the gold simply ceased to exist. Holmes regarded him with his usual calm, fingers steepled beneath his chin. Begin at the beginning, if you please. Omit no detail, however trivial it may seem. Forster nodded. The last audit of the vault was conducted at 8 o'clock in the evening, 2 nights ago. At that time, every note and every bar of gold was accounted for. The vault was sealed and locked, and the keys remained in the possession of the night supervisor, Mr. Henry Tolliver. Holmes's eyes flickered with interest. And Mr. Tolliver's whereabouts that evening? At his post, without deviation. The vault is accessed by a single corridor, under constant watch by armed guards. No one entered or exited after the final audit. And yet, when the morning shift arrived, Forster broke off, his voice faltering. The vault was empty. Watson, unable to contain his astonishment, interjected. But that is impossible. A locked vault cannot empty itself, nor can a thief vanish into thin air. Forster's face was grim. Precisely, Doctor. And yet that is exactly what has occurred. The locks were intact, the security seals unbroken, the corridor undisturbed. Not a single alarm was triggered. Scotland Yard has examined every inch of the premises and found no evidence of tampering. Holmes closed his eyes for a moment, exhaling a thin stream of smoke from his pipe. A most fascinating conundrum. And what of the night guards? Did they report anything unusual? Forster hesitated. Nothing of consequence. A few claimed to have felt somewhat drowsy, but as they worked through the night, this was not deemed significant. Holmes's eyes snapped open. Drowsy, you say? Yes, though none recalled falling asleep. Holmes exchanged a glance with Watson, a flicker of something keen and sharp in his expression. Curious, he murmured. Very curious indeed. You must understand, Mr. Holmes, Forster continued, that the pressure upon us is immense. The very integrity of the Bank of England has been compromised. If the public were to learn of this... He stopped, shaking his head. Panic, ruin, and chaos would follow. Holmes inclined his head. And so naturally Scotland Yard has been called upon. Forster exhaled sharply. Yes, Inspector Lestrade is leading the investigation. He is convinced that it must have been an inside job. Holmes smiled faintly. And what is your opinion of that theory? Forster hesitated. It would be the simplest explanation, and yet I cannot bring myself to believe it. Every employee has been rigorously questioned, every alibi verified. No one had the opportunity to commit the crime, and yet... His hands clenched involuntarily. The gold is gone. At that moment, a familiar tread sounded upon the staircase, and a moment later Inspector Lestrade strode into the room. He removed his bowler hat with a perfunctory nod toward Forster, before fixing his gaze upon Holmes. "Well, Mr. Holmes," he said briskly, "I assume you've heard of our little puzzle?" Holmes leaned back, a trace of amusement upon his lips. "Indeed, Lestrade, and I hear you have already solved it." Lestrade gave a snort. "Hardly. But mark my words, it's an inside job if ever there was one. No one gets in or out of that vault without help from within." Holmes regarded him thoughtfully. "And yet, you have no evidence." Lestrade scowled. "Not yet, but give me time. One of those clerks knows more than he's letting on." Holmes exhaled a slow curl of smoke, his gaze drifting toward the ceiling. "Perhaps," he murmured. "Or perhaps, Lestrade, you were looking in the wrong direction entirely." The following morning, Holmes and I set out for the Bank of England. The autumn air was crisp, and a light mist clung to the city, lending an almost spectral quality to the streets. Holmes strode forward with his usual energy, his sharp eyes betraying an eagerness that I had come to recognize. He was already deep in his mental calculations, assembling the puzzle before we had even reached our destination. Upon our arrival, we were met at the entrance by Inspector Lestrade, who greeted Holmes with a mixture of professional rivalry and reluctant admiration. Beside him stood Mr. Archibald Forster, the bank's security director, his face lined with the worry of a man whose entire reputation hung in the balance. "Well, Mr. Holmes," Lestrade said briskly, "here we are. I don't suppose you'll find much that we haven't already examined, but I expect you'll insist on having a look for yourself." "Naturally, Lestrade," Holmes replied, his tone pleasant yet dismissive. "I should be most obliged if you would lead the way." Forster ushered us through the imposing marble corridors of the bank, past clerks and tellers, who cast us anxious glances, until we reached a thick iron door at the end of a narrow corridor. "The vault is just beyond," Forster said, his voice tight with unease. "It is the very heart of the Bank of England's security, an impenetrable fortress, or so we believed." Holmes paused for a moment, taking in every detail of the corridor before nodding for Forster to proceed. "Let us see, then, how the impossible has been made possible." The vault door loomed before us, a formidable structure of reinforced steel, its massive hinges and complex locking mechanism a testament to the pinnacle of modern security. And yet, it had failed. Holmes moved forward, running his fingers lightly over the door's surface. "You say it was found locked in the morning, precisely as it had been the night before?" Forster nodded. "Not a scratch upon it. The guards swear that no one entered, and yet when the morning audit was conducted, the gold was gone." Holmes crouched, his sharp gaze tracing the edges of the door, then the lock itself. He withdrew his magnifying glass, inspecting it with the precision of a jeweller examining a rare gem. "Interesting," he murmured. "And the key?" Forster handed over a heavy brass key. "Each night, it remains in the possession of the night supervisor, Henry Tolliver. He swears he never used it, nor was it taken from him." Holmes studied it briefly before returning it. "And alternative means of entry? A secondary door? A hidden passage?" "None," Forster replied. "This is the only way in or out. The walls are reinforced to withstand any attempt at forced entry." Holmes straightened and turned his attention to the floor. He knelt once more, running his fingers lightly over the cold stone, his brows drawing together ever so slightly. "There are marks here, faint but present. Something has been dragged." He looked up at Lestrade. "Have your men noted this?" Lestrade frowned, stepping closer. "We saw no sign of forced entry, Holmes. If something was dragged, it must have been inside the vault itself." Holmes smiled faintly. "Precisely, Lestrade. Which begs the question, what was it?" Forster shifted uncomfortably. "There were no reports of anything unusual. The vault was locked as always." Holmes straightened, dusting off his hands. "Then, gentlemen, I suspect that the answer lies not in what was seen, but in what was overlooked." We moved away from the vault as Holmes turned his attention to the night guards. 3 men stood in a row, their stiff postures betraying the discomfort of close scrutiny. "You were stationed outside the vault all night?" Holmes inquired. "Yes, sir," one of them, a tall man with a lined face, replied. "Not a soul passed through that door. If they had, I'd have seen them." Holmes clasped his hands behind his back, tilting his head slightly. And yet, when morning arrived, the vault was empty. The guard hesitated, his brow furrowing. "Aye, sir, but we did our duty. We—" He stopped, glancing at the others. "We never left our posts." Holmes's gaze sharpened. "Never?" "Not even for a moment." The second guard, a younger man, shifted uneasily. "Well, we felt a bit off that night. Drowsy-like. Strange, but we thought nothing of it. Just the late hours, I expect." Holmes turned to Forster. "Did your men report this?" Forster looked startled. "Number, I was unaware of any such complaint." Holmes nodded thoughtfully. "Drowsiness. And tell me, gentlemen, was there any unusual scent in the air that evening?" The first guard frowned. "Now that you mention it, aye, something faint, almost like almonds." Holmes exchanged a glance with me, a gleam of understanding flashing in his eyes. "Almonds? Curious indeed." Lestrade, ever impatient, crossed his arms. "And what does that tell you, Holmes?" Holmes smiled faintly, his gaze fixed on the vault door once more. "That, my dear Lestrade, remains to be seen." Holmes turned his attention to the narrow passageway leading to the vault, his keen eyes scrutinizing every inch. "You say, Forster, that this corridor is the only means of access?" "Yes," Forster affirmed. "At night, it is guarded at both ends. No man could pass unseen." Holmes nodded, stepping forward with deliberate slowness. The corridor was long and unremarkable, its polished floor reflecting the dim glow of the overhead gas lamps. "How often do the guards patrol?" "They remain stationed at either end," Forster replied. "At intervals they signal to confirm their presence. There is no blind spot, no gap in vigilance." Holmes glanced at Lestrade. "And your men have found no sign of forced entry?" "None," Lestrade replied, with a touch of impatience. "The vault was locked. The guards saw nothing. It's an inside job, Holmes. I'll wager my reputation on it." Holmes, unperturbed, continued his examination. He crouched, running his fingers lightly over the floorboards, before straightening with an air of quiet satisfaction. "A fascinating predicament," he murmured. "A corridor watched at all hours, a vault undisturbed, and yet the crime is committed with perfect execution. Tell me, Forster, have your men considered the possibility that the thief did not enter this corridor at all?" Forster blinked. "But that would be—" He hesitated, his brow furrowing. "Impossible." "Nothing is impossible," Holmes corrected, "merely improbable. And yet, we must consider every improbability, no matter how fantastic it may seem." Watson, sensing the shift in Holmes's tone, knew with certainty that his friend had caught the faintest thread of an idea, one that would soon unravel the entire mystery. Holmes stepped back toward the vault, his expression one of profound concentration. He drew in a slow breath through his nostrils, then again, this time with greater deliberation. Forster regarded him with some confusion. "Mr. Holmes," Holmes lifted a hand. "Do you perceive it, Watson?" I hesitated. "Perceive what?" Holmes exhaled softly. "There is a faint scent in the air, subtle yet unmistakable. It lingers near the entrance of the vault, as though it has settled into the very walls." I sniffed, but detected nothing beyond the metallic chill of the vault itself. "I fear my senses are not as finely attuned as yours, Holmes." Forster exchanged a glance with Lestrade, who merely shrugged. "I smell nothing either." Holmes smiled faintly. Then allow me to be more specific. It is a chemical scent, elusive, yet with a distinct trace of almonds. At the word, Forster stiffened. Almonds? Precisely, Holmes said. A curious detail, is it not? Forster hesitated before speaking. It is strange, now that you mention it. One of the guards remarked upon a peculiar odour that evening, but as it was so faint, we thought nothing of it. Lestrade snorted. And what of it, Holmes? A faint smell hardly explains how £50,000 in gold disappeared. Holmes chuckled. No, but it does suggest that we are dealing with a criminal of uncommon ingenuity. One who understands that the mind can be deceived as easily as the eyes. With that, Holmes withdrew his notebook and made a brief entry, his expression unreadable. I had no doubt that in his mind, the pieces were already beginning to align. Holmes turned his attention to the assembled bank officials, his sharp gaze moving from one face to another with quiet intensity. The manager, a stout and balding gentleman by the name of Mr. Clarence Hargreaves, stood with his arms crossed, his expression a mixture of apprehension and indignation. Beside him were the chief security officer, Mr. Jonathan Pierce, and 3 senior accountants, each looking as though they had been summoned to face a tribunal. Holmes clasped his hands behind his back and addressed them in his measured tone. Gentlemen, I shall require absolute honesty in your responses. The smallest inconsistency may prove vital in uncovering the truth. Now, Mr. Hargreaves, I understand that you personally oversaw the final audit on the night of the theft. The manager nodded stiffly. Yes, Mr. Holmes. At precisely 8 o'clock, I reviewed the inventory alongside Mr. Cartwright, our chief accountant. Every note and gold bar was accounted for. The vault was sealed, and I left the premises soon after. Holmes turned his attention to Mr. Pierce, the head of security. And your men reported nothing amiss throughout the night? Pierce hesitated. Nothing of note, sir. The guards at the vault remained at their posts, and the corridor remained undisturbed. The only movements recorded were the usual rounds conducted every half hour. Holmes tapped his fingers together, and yet, despite this, the gold was gone by morning. He let the words linger before continuing. Mr. Cartwright, you assisted in the final audit. Can you confirm that nothing was unusual? Cartwright swallowed, his fingers twitching slightly. Yes, sir. Everything was in order. Holmes's gaze did not waver. And yet, I perceive a certain nervousness in your demeanour. Perhaps you recall something of importance. Cartwright hesitated, but shook his head. No, sir. I am simply troubled by the whole affair, as we all are. Holmes regarded him for a long moment before turning to the bank manager once more. One final question, Mr. Hargreaves. Has any employee been dismissed or left the bank service in recent weeks? Hargreaves frowned. As a matter of fact, yes. A man named Lionel Drake was dismissed not 2 months ago. A most unfortunate business. Holmes' eyes gleamed. Indeed. Then I believe it is high time we learned more about Mr. Drake. Who is this Lionel Drake? Holmes inquired, his fingers lightly drumming against his coat sleeve. Hargreaves sighed. Drake was an assistant in our security division. Competent, but reckless. He had a tendency toward financial indiscretion, gambling debts mostly. When discrepancies were found in his records, we had no choice but to let him go. Holmes leaned forward slightly. Discrepancies, you say? Do you believe he had been stealing from the bank? Hargreaves shook his head. Not outright, but there were irregularities in his accounts. A missing ledger here, an unbalanced figure there. He was dismissed quietly to avoid scandal. Lestrade, who had been listening with growing interest, gave a satisfied grunt. Now there's a suspect, if ever I saw one. A man with debts, dismissed under questionable circumstances, and with knowledge of the bank's inner workings. If you ask me, Holmes, I'd say we have our man. Holmes regarded him with a look of mild amusement. If only criminal investigations were as simple as identifying the most obvious suspect, Lestrade. And yet, I have found that the most blatant culprits are often the least likely to be guilty. Lestrade scoffed. And I suppose you have a better theory. Holmes ignored him and turned back to Hargreaves. Where might we find this Mr. Drake? For a time, he lodged at a boarding house in Whitechapel, Hargreaves replied. But after his dismissal, he disappeared. There were whispers that he had fallen in with a rougher crowd, men of ill repute. Holmes nodded. A man with debts, dismissed under suspicion, and now consorting with criminals. Whether or not he is our thief, he certainly warrants investigation. Watson, I believe a visit to Whitechapel is in order. As we prepared to depart, I could not shake the feeling that we were stepping into deeper waters than we had anticipated. Holmes, however, seemed invigorated. The game, as ever, was afoot. Holmes wasted no time in directing our cab towards Soho, his mind evidently occupied with deductions known only to himself. I had long since ceased to question him during these moments of deep contemplation, knowing that an ill-timed inquiry would only earn me a cryptic reply. Instead, I contented myself with observing the streets of London as they passed, their familiar bustle now tinged with the weight of the mystery we pursued. At last, we arrived before a modest establishment with a brass plaque that read, Dr. Mortimer Blake, Specialist in Toxicology and Experimental Chemistry. Holmes led the way inside, where we were greeted by the man himself, a wiry figure with sharp features and a pair of thick spectacles perched upon his nose. "Ah, Sherlock!" Blake exclaimed, his voice tinged with both familiarity and amusement. "And Dr. Watson, I presume. What brings you gentlemen to my humble laboratory?" "A most intriguing case, Mortimer," Holmes replied. "One which, I suspect, may require your expertise." Blake gestured us toward a cluttered workspace, where an array of beakers and glass vials emitted strange fumes. Holmes withdrew a small handkerchief, carefully folded, and handed it to the chemist. "This bears traces of an odour detected at the scene of a most peculiar robbery," Holmes explained. "Pray tell me, Mortimer, what you make of it." Blake took the cloth, brought it to his nose, and inhaled lightly. Almost immediately, his expression shifted from mild curiosity to something more serious. "Fascinating," he murmured, stepping toward a cabinet of glass vials. "There is something here, certainly, though faint. Give me but a moment, and I shall have your answer." Holmes nodded, his expression unreadable. "I suspected as much. Let us hope your findings confirm my theory." Dr. Blake set about his task with remarkable efficiency, producing a series of reagents which he applied to the cloth. As he worked, I turned to Holmes. "You anticipated this result," I said. "What do you suspect?" Holmes did not answer immediately, his gaze fixed upon Blake's precise movements. At last, the chemist straightened, holding up the cloth. "Chloroform-based," he declared, "but not ordinary chloroform. This has been refined with an additive, increasing its potency while making it almost undetectable." Holmes allowed himself the barest flicker of satisfaction. "Precisely, Mortimer. A gas designed not to render one unconscious, but to induce a state of temporary confusion and drowsiness." Blake nodded. Indeed, a person exposed to this in small doses would likely remain awake but disoriented, their perception dulled. They might struggle to recall precise details of the moments before exposure. I felt a chill at the realization. "The guards!" I exclaimed. "They reported feeling drowsy that night." "Exactly, Watson," Holmes replied. "The scent in the vault was the final confirmation I required. Someone introduced this chemical into the air, clouding the minds of those standing watch. They would have seen and heard nothing, yet, crucially, they would not recall having lost time. To them, all would seem unchanged, just as our thief intended." Blake looked grim. A devilish trick. But how was it administered? Holmes gave a thin smile. "That, my dear Mortimer, is the next question we must answer, and I believe I already know where to look." We returned to the Bank of England that afternoon, Holmes striding with renewed purpose through the grand entrance hall. Lestrade, who had been awaiting our arrival, fell into step beside us with an air of scepticism. "I trust your little visit to the chemist has produced a miracle, Holmes," he remarked dryly. "Merely a confirmation of what I already suspected," Holmes replied. "And now, my dear Lestrade, I require another look at the vault." Lestrade sighed, but gestured for us to follow. Once inside, Holmes moved with the focused energy of a man who saw what others had overlooked. He produced a small magnifying lens from his coat and crouched before the great iron door, inspecting its edges with meticulous care. "Watson, observe," he murmured, pointing to an almost imperceptible line along the base of the locking mechanism. "Do you see it?" I knelt beside him, but could discern nothing at first. Then, as the light from my pocket lantern struck the surface at an angle, I noticed it. A faint scattering of what appeared to be metallic dust glistening against the steel. "Metal shavings!" I exclaimed. "Precisely," Holmes said, his voice edged with satisfaction. "A detail so minuscule that an untrained eye would dismiss it entirely. And yet, it tells us everything." Lestrade frowned. "And what does it tell us, Holmes?" Holmes straightened, dusting off his hands. "That our thief did not rely on brute force, but rather on a method of exquisite precision. The lock was not picked, nor was it forced. It was altered at the most fundamental level, and with such delicacy that no sign of the intrusion remained." Lestrade's brows knitted together. "But how?" Holmes smiled faintly. "Ah, Lestrade, that is precisely the question we shall now answer." Holmes retrieved his pocket notebook and made a few swift entries before turning to address us. "The presence of metal shavings suggests the use of a specialized tool, one capable of subtly modifying the mechanism without causing outright destruction," he explained. "We must consider then what such an instrument might be." "A file, perhaps," I suggested. Holmes shook his head. "Too imprecise. A file would leave visible abrasions, and there are none. No, Watson, this required something more refined. A tool capable of burrowing into the lock with almost surgical accuracy." Lestrade folded his arms. "And what sort of instrument would do that?" "A high-precision drill," Holmes replied. "Not the coarse sort used by common burglars, but a specialized implement, likely designed for delicate engineering work." Forster, who had been listening intently, interjected. "But how would the thief have used such a tool without making a sound? The vault is within earshot of the guards." "A most pertinent question," Holmes said, "and I believe the answer lies in the very substance we have already identified." Understanding dawned upon me. The chloroform compound. The guards were drugged, momentarily aware, but unable to register what was happening. Holmes nodded approvingly. "Precisely. The gas subdued their senses just enough that they perceived nothing amiss. The thief, armed with his specialized drill, worked in silence while the world carried on obliviously around him. Lestrade let out a low whistle. A devilish trick, Holmes. But who possesses both the knowledge of the vault and the skill to carry it out? Holmes tucked his notebook away. That, my dear Lestrade, is the final piece of our puzzle, and I believe I know exactly where to find it. It was not 2 days later that a second, equally audacious attempt was made, this time at the Kensington branch of the London and Western Bank. The news reached us by way of a breathless messenger from Scotland Yard, and within the hour, Holmes and I found ourselves once more in the presence of Inspector Lestrade. "It was the same method, Holmes," Lestrade said, his voice tight with frustration. "The vault was untouched. The guards saw nothing, and yet there was an attempt to breach it. This time, we caught a man loitering near the premises. He fled, but we retrieved something of interest." He reached into his coat and withdrew a small leather pouch, placing it upon the table before Holmes. With practiced ease, Holmes loosened the drawstring and upended its contents into his palm. A set of fine metal instruments tumbled forth, delicate, slender tools, each designed for precise mechanical work. Holmes studied them closely, his long fingers selecting a thin, conical drill with an almost surgical point. "This," he murmured, "is the instrument of our phantom thief." Lestrade gave a satisfied nod. "A locksmith's tool, no doubt, and if we find the man who owns it—" "We shall have more than a mere locksmith, Lestrade," Holmes interrupted. "This is not the work of a common burglar. This is a man of extraordinary skill and training, operating under great duress. His first crime was executed with exacting patience, but this second attempt, reckless, I supplied." Holmes inclined his head. "Precisely, Watson. He grows desperate. That is most telling." Lestrade frowned. "You believe he is running out of time?" Holmes let the drill roll between his fingers before placing it back in the pouch. "Or he is running out of control. Either way, the moment of reckoning approaches." Lestrade's man had also uncovered a peculiar detail. On the night of the original theft, an unfamiliar figure had been seen loitering near the Bank of England. A foreigner, dressed well, but moving with the wary manner of one accustomed to secrecy. "An Eastern European, by the sound of it," Lestrade said, tapping a report. "Spoke English well enough, but with a heavy accent. Gave his name as Gregor Ivankov and claimed to be in London on business. Yet no record of his entry exists, and he has not been seen since." Holmes took the report from Lestrade and scanned it with sharp interest. "Ivankov," he mused. "Yes, the name is known to me. A smuggler of considerable repute. He operates between Odessa and London, dealing in goods of dubious legality, gold, gemstones, and on occasion, stolen securities." "A receiver of stolen property?" I asked. Holmes smiled faintly. "More than that, Watson. A man of such means does not involve himself in petty theft. If Ivankov was present, it was not by chance. He was here for a reason." Lestrade snorted. "Then all we need do is find him." Holmes chuckled. "A task easier said than done, my dear Lestrade. But we need not chase shadows. We need only follow the light. If Ivankov was in London, he left a trace, however faint. And I suspect there is one man who may know precisely what that trace is. That man was Edward Cartwright, the chief accountant of the Bank of England. From the moment we had met him, I had observed his discomfort, his fingers twitching, his gaze darting away at the wrong moments. Holmes had noticed it too. It was time to press him. We called upon the bank once more, where Cartwright received us with forced composure. Holmes wasted no time. "Mr. Cartwright," he said, fixing the man with his piercing gaze, "I am certain you are a man of unimpeachable integrity. And yet, I must ask, what is it that troubles your conscience?" Cartwright's throat bobbed as he swallowed. "Nothing, Mr. Holmes. I have told you all I know." Holmes sighed. "Then let me be direct. On the night of the theft, you saw something, or someone, that gave you pause. You dismissed it as unimportant, perhaps out of fear or out of loyalty to another. But you know, Mr. Cartwright, and it is eating away at you." For a moment, there was silence. Then, with a tremulous breath, Cartwright whispered, I did see someone." Holmes leaned forward. "A foreign gentleman, perhaps?" Cartwright's hands clenched. "Yes." Holmes smiled. "Now, my dear sir, let us hear exactly what you saw." The hour was late when Holmes finally set down his pipe and turned to us with the air of a man who had reached the pinnacle of a grand design. "The time for passive observation is over," he declared. "Now, we must draw the villain into the open." Lestrade, who had been nursing a lukewarm cup of tea, sat up with interest. "You have a plan, then?" Holmes smiled. "I propose we give our thief exactly what he desires. Another opportunity." Lestrade frowned. "You mean to let him strike again?" "Not quite," Holmes replied. "But we shall let him believe that such an opportunity exists. We will spread word, through the appropriate channels, that a second shipment of gold, this one double the size of the first, is to arrive at the Bank of England within the next 2 nights. The information will, of course, be leaked in the right places, ensuring that it reaches the ears of our adversary." Lestrade nodded. "And when he takes the bait, we'll be waiting." "Precisely," Holmes said. "But it must be done subtly. A man who has planned such an elaborate crime will not walk blindly into a trap. He will observe, he will analyse, and only when he is convinced that the circumstances align in his favour will he make his move. We must ensure that he believes the bank is unprepared, that the security is unchanged, and that he has as clear a path as before." "And if he does not take the bait?" I asked. Holmes glanced at me with amusement. "Then, my dear Watson, I shall have greatly misjudged my opponent. But I think that is unlikely. He has already made one desperate attempt. He cannot afford to stop now." With that, the plan was set in motion. Lestrade saw to it that discreet murmurs of the supposed shipment found their way into the right circles, while Holmes, with his characteristic precision, orchestrated the finer details of the deception. The stage was being set, and all that remained was to ensure that the players took their places. 2 nights later, the Bank of England stood in quiet anticipation. To any ordinary observer, it was as it had always been. Its great doors locked, its corridors patrolled by weary guards. But beneath the surface, the entire scene had been meticulously arranged for a single purpose. Lestrade had placed plainclothes officers at key vantage points, ensuring that every entry and exit was under careful watch. The usual night guards remained at their posts, oblivious to the deception unfolding around them. The only deviation from the ordinary was one that had been made with the utmost secrecy. I would be stationed inside the vault itself. "You must be our eyes and ears, Watson," Holmes had instructed me. "Observe everything, hear everything, but above all, remain unseen." I had protested, of course. The idea of locking oneself inside a vault with no immediate means of escape was hardly comforting, but Holmes had been insistent, and so, with some reluctance, I found myself standing within the cavernous steel chamber, listening to the sound of my own breathing. Outside, the night deepened, Hours passed with agonizing slowness, the stillness broken only by the occasional footstep of a patrolling officer. My senses, sharpened by the oppressive silence, caught every minor sound: the distant chime of a carriage bell, the faint rustle of wind against the building's facade. Then, at last, I heard it, a noise so faint that I almost dismissed it, a whisper of movement, subtle, calculated. My pulse quickened. Someone was out there. Someone was coming. I strained my ears, willing myself to remain calm. A second noise, clearer this time, a soft metallic scrape, deliberate and precise. And then, unmistakably, the slow, deliberate turn of the vault's locking mechanism. The trap had been sprung. The air inside the vault was stifling, heavy with an unnatural silence that pressed upon my ears. I stood perfectly still, my pulse quickening as I listened. The faint metallic scrape I had heard moments before came again, this time accompanied by a rhythmic, deliberate ticking, like the sound of a watch being wound. Somewhere beyond the steel door, the thief was at work. I pressed myself into the shadows, forcing calm upon my racing thoughts. Holmes had predicted that our adversary would act swiftly, but even he could not have foreseen the sheer precision with which the crime was unfolding. There was no fumbling, no wasted movement, only the measured efficiency of a master at his craft. A soft click, then another. The lock's tumblers were shifting, one by one, as though guided by invisible hands. The work of a crude burglar would have been punctuated by hurried motions, the occasional curse muttered under breath. But this was a process executed with meticulous care. I exhaled slowly, barely daring to breathe. A minute passed, then another. At last, the heavy locking mechanism gave a final, almost imperceptible turn. The door did not groan or creak as it was eased open. It moved as silently as a whisper. The intruder had taken every precaution, leaving no trace of his presence. Then, in the dim glow of my concealed lantern, I saw him. A figure slipped into the vault, moving with uncanny grace. The man was dressed in dark clothing, his face partially obscured by the brim of his hat. He carried a small satchel, the unmistakable gleam of fine metal tools visible within. My fingers tensed around the revolver Holmes had insisted I carry. But I did not move. Not yet. The thief reached into his coat and withdrew a vial, uncorking it with a precise flick of the wrist. A moment later, he tipped its contents into a small device that hissed softly as it released an invisible mist into the air. The same gas that had lulled the guards into passive disorientation. The man was ensuring that no one would notice his presence until it was far too late. Little did he know that this time someone was watching. The moment had come. My hand tightened around the revolver's grip, but before I could make my move, a voice rang out, calm, unhurried, yet unmistakably authoritative. "That will do, Mr. Cartwright." The thief froze. From the darkness behind him, Sherlock Holmes stepped forward, his keen eyes gleaming with quiet triumph. A second figure emerged beside him, Lestrade, his revolver raised in steady precision. For a brief instant, Cartwright remained motionless. Then, with the swiftness of a man well versed in escape, he spun on his heel, reaching for something within his coat. Holmes, anticipating the motion, had already moved. With a deft flick of his cane, he struck the man's wrist, sending a small glass vial crashing to the floor. A pungent, acrid scent filled the air, the last remnants of his anesthetic compound. "Another step, and I shall be forced to take firmer action," Holmes warned. Cartwright hesitated, his eyes darting between Holmes and Lestrade, his mind no doubt racing for an alternative means of retreat. But he had none. The game was up. Lestrade stepped forward, seizing the man's arms and pulling them behind his back. "Edward Cartwright," he declared, "you are under arrest for attempted robbery, conspiracy, and the theft of £50,000 from the Bank of England." Cartwright, his composure faltering, let out a sharp breath. "You have no proof." Holmes smiled faintly. "On the contrary, we have all the proof we require." He gestured toward the scattered tools, the empty vial, the partially breached lock. "You might have vanished into the night unseen, Mr. Cartwright. But you left a trail only a blind man would fail to follow." Cartwright's shoulders slumped. He had been bested, and he knew it. Lestrade signalled to his officers, who moved in swiftly to take the prisoner into custody. Holmes turned to me, a flicker of amusement in his gaze. "Well, Watson," he said, dusting off his coat, "I dare say this concludes our rather invisible robbery." And with that, the mystery was laid to rest. Cartwright sat in sullen silence, his hands bound before him, as Holmes paced the confines of the vault with measured steps. Lestrade stood nearby, arms folded, his expression one of barely concealed triumph. The officers had secured the scene, and there remained but one final act, the revelation of the truth. Holmes stopped abruptly before our captive. "You were meticulous, Mr. Cartwright," he said, his tone almost appreciative. "Your plan was as elegant as it was audacious, and yet, like all criminal enterprises, it contained a single fatal flaw." Cartwright scoffed, though there was a note of unease in his voice. "You have nothing on me, Holmes. A man standing outside a vault with a set of tools hardly proves his guilt." Holmes smiled. "Ah, but you see, I have not yet explained how the crime was committed. Shall I do so now, for the benefit of all present?" He did not wait for an answer. From the outset, it appeared to be an impossibility, an impenetrable vault, watched at all hours. And yet the gold vanished without a trace. Scotland Yard, naturally, assumed an inside job, but the truth was far more ingenious. He gestured toward the vault door. "The key to your deception lay not in entering the vault, but in ensuring that no one noticed when you did. You accomplished this in two ways. First, by introducing a chemical compound into the air, a variant of chloroform designed to dull the senses without rendering the victim unconscious. The guards, believing themselves awake, perceived nothing amiss, while in reality their faculties were compromised just enough to overlook the faintest of disturbances." Lestrade frowned. "Even so, how did he get in?" "The door was locked from the inside." "Precisely, Lestrade. That was the brilliance of it." Holmes turned to Cartwright. "You did not open the vault from the outside at all, did you? Instead, you installed a timed mechanism, one that would, at a precise moment, retract the locking bolts and allow entry without the need for a key." A flicker of shock crossed Cartwright's features. Holmes had struck upon the truth. Holmes leaned in, his voice now almost a whisper. "It was never a question of how you got in, Mr. Cartwright. The real question was, how long had you already been inside?" And with that, the final piece of the puzzle fell into place. 3 days after Cartwright's capture, we assembled in the familiar sitting room of 221B Baker Street, where Holmes had requested the presence of all principal figures in the case. Mr. Archibald Forster, the beleaguered Director of Security, sat stiffly in one chair, his expression one of anxious anticipation. Inspector Lestrade occupied another, his arms folded and his mouth set in its usual sceptical line. And in the corner, under close police watch, sat Edward Cartwright, his features now composed, but his eyes betraying the unease of a man who knew his game was lost. Holmes, ever the master of theatrics, remained standing by the fireplace, his fingers steepled before him. "Gentlemen," he began, "you are gathered here because you have each played a role in what may be the most sophisticated act of larceny ever attempted upon the Bank of England. I refer, of course, to the robbery which, by all conventional logic, ought to have been impossible." He turned to Forster. From the first, the greatest puzzle was not what was taken, but how. A vault, locked from the inside, untouched by human hands, yet emptied overnight. The simplest minds would cry, "inside job." But simplicity is the enemy of true deduction. Lestrade huffed. And yet the culprit was inside the bank, was he not? Holmes smiled. "Indeed, Lestrade, but not in the way you presumed. Mr. Cartwright was neither a mere accomplice nor a convenient scapegoat. He was the architect of the crime." Cartwright gave no reaction, save for a tightening of his jaw. Holmes continued, his voice carrying a note of admiration. "You see, gentlemen, this was not a burglary. It was a work of precision, deception, and science, executed with an ingenuity that, had it not been turned toward crime, might have earned Cartwright distinction in the highest circles of mechanical engineering." Lestrade's eyes narrowed. "Then tell us, Holmes, how was it done?" Holmes took a long breath, then leaned forward, his voice dropping slightly. "By making the impossible seem ordinary. The genius of the crime," Holmes began, "lay not in brute force, but in illusion. Cartwright's goal was simple, to remove the gold without detection. His challenge was that the vault's security was impenetrable from the outside. So he did the only logical thing. He placed himself inside." Forster looked startled. "Inside? But how?" "A timed mechanism," Holmes said smoothly. "Cartwright, an expert locksmith, designed a delayed unlocking system inside the vault's locking mechanism. Before the vault was sealed for the night, he placed within it a precision device, a series of minuscule gears and springs that, once activated, would slowly release the locking bolts over several hours. By the time the morning audit arrived, the vault would be open, but only after the crime was already complete." Lestrade's brows furrowed. "But that still doesn't explain how the gold was taken out." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Patience, Lestrade. There is more." He turned back to Forster. "The guards stationed outside the vault. Tell me, did they report any disturbances?" Forster shook his head. "None. They claim to have been awake and alert the entire night." Holmes nodded. "And yet, they were not. They had no memory of missing time, because Cartwright ensured they experienced no perceivable lapse. He introduced into the vault a highly refined chloroform derivative, a gas so subtle that it dulled awareness without inducing unconsciousness. The guards were awake, but their senses were compromised. They could not perceive what they were not meant to perceive. The vault could have been emptied before their very eyes, and they would have registered nothing." Forster's face paled. "Good heavens!" "Indeed," Holmes said. "Once the mechanism disengaged the lock, Cartwright and his associates removed the gold with careful precision, likely using concealed passageways or false-bottomed transport crates. The vault was then sealed again. The gas dissipated into the night air, and by morning, it was as though nothing had changed, except, of course, that £50,000 had vanished into the ether." Lestrade let out a slow whistle. "A robbery in plain sight, and no one saw a thing." Holmes inclined his head. "An illusion of normalcy, my dear Lestrade. And that, after all, is the greatest deception of all." By the following morning, the case had reached its inevitable conclusion. Scotland Yard wasted no time in acting upon Holmes's deductions, and before the day was out, all parties involved in the scheme found themselves in police custody. Edward Cartwright, the architect of the crime, remained impassive as the charges were laid against him. He had played his hand brilliantly, but as Holmes had so often remarked, the criminal mind, no matter how ingenious, always leaves a loose thread. And in this instance, the unravelling had been swift and merciless. Lionel Drake, the dismissed bank employee, was found attempting to flee the country under an assumed name. His role had been a vital one, providing Cartwright with the precise security details necessary to bypass the bank's defences. The prospect of financial ruin had driven him to desperation, and in the end, desperation had led him straight into the arms of the law. As for Gregor Ivankov, the enigmatic foreigner, he was apprehended aboard a ship bound for Rotterdam. The stolen gold had not yet left English shores, and thanks to Holmes's intervention, the greater portion of it was recovered intact. Ivankov, it seemed, had little interest in speaking when confronted by Lestrade and his officers. A professional in his own right, he knew when a game was lost. The press wasted no time in reporting the capture of the invisible thieves, as they had come to be known. But it was not long before the familiar refrain emerged. Scotland Yard had prevailed once again, securing victory for law and order. Holmes naturally made no effort to correct this version of events. As for myself, I could not help but marvel at the sheer audacity of the crime, and the equal brilliance with which Holmes had dismantled it. Justice had been served, and yet, as we would soon see, some victories are not without their ironies. A week after the case had concluded, Holmes and I were seated at 221B Baker Street, enjoying a rare moment of peace, when a familiar voice echoed from the staircase. "Holmes, you'll want to see this." Inspector Lestrade entered, waving a freshly printed edition of the Times. Holmes accepted it without comment, scanning the headline with an amused flicker in his eyes. "Brilliant detective work by Scotland Yard. The bank robbers brought to justice." Lestrade, looking particularly pleased with himself, took a seat and stretched out his legs. "Thought you might like that one, Holmes." A tidy little case, if I say so myself. We had it well in hand from the start, of course, but your input certainly expedited things. Holmes's lips twitched. "Your generosity is overwhelming, Lestrade." The inspector continued, oblivious to the sarcasm. "Naturally, I made sure your name was included, somewhere near the end. Can't have the Yard looking entirely incapable, you understand." Holmes nodded solemnly. "Quite understandable. I could bear it no longer. Really, Lestrade, if anyone solved this case, it was Holmes. You would have been searching for an inside man to this day, had he not pointed you in the right direction." Lestrade grinned. "Come now, Doctor. Let us not quibble over details. The crime is solved, the gold recovered, and the City of London can rest easy. Who could ask for more?" Holmes, ever the picture of composure, simply set the paper aside. "Indeed, Lestrade, who could ask for more?" The inspector, having secured his moment of triumph, bid us farewell soon after. As the door closed behind him, I turned to Holmes, still bristling at the injustice of it. "You let him have it without a word!" Holmes smiled faintly, reaching for his pipe. "Lestrade is like a child, Watson. He must be allowed his victories, however illusory they may be." I sighed, shaking my head. "And yet, it is you who solved the crime." Holmes exhaled a thin curl of smoke. "My dear Watson," he murmured, "surely by now you must realise the truth is rarely as important as the story." As was always the case following one of Holmes's great triumphs, I found myself compelled to put pen to paper. The affair of the bank robbery. No one saw, would, I knew, be remembered not just for the scale of its deception, but for the sheer intricacy of the plot. Few crimes had ever been so meticulously planned, and fewer still had been so flawlessly dismantled. I glanced up from my notes to find Holmes seated opposite me, his gaze distant as he regarded the flickering fire. I knew better than to disturb him in such moments. His mind was, no doubt, already engaged with some new enigma, some puzzle yet unsolved. Still, I could not resist asking, "Was there ever a moment where you doubted your theory?" Holmes arched a brow. "Doubt, Watson, is the luxury of those who lack evidence. The moment I detected the lingering scent in the vault, the case was all but solved." I set down my pen. It was an elegant crime, in its own way. "Ah," Holmes said, a trace of amusement in his voice. "But therein lies the flaw of all elegant crimes. They assume the world is blind." I leaned back in my chair, watching him as he methodically packed his pipe. "And yet Lestrade takes the credit, and Scotland Yard basks in the glory." Holmes chuckled. "Let them have their moment, Watson. The game itself is the only reward I require." I smiled, shaking my head. "And yet, I shall record it, so that the truth may be known, at least to those who care to seek it." Holmes met my gaze, and for the briefest moment, I thought I saw something akin to gratitude flicker across his face. Then, with a final exhale of smoke, he leaned back into his chair and murmured, "You see, Watson, the greatest trick a criminal can pull is not to disappear, but to remain unseen." And with that, the case was closed. As the fire crackled in the hearth of 221B Baker Street, I set down my pen and regarded my friend, who sat opposite me in his usual chair, a thin wisp of smoke curling from his pipe. He had solved countless cases, but there was something about this one, the crime that was never seen, yet perfectly executed, that left me deep in thought. "You were right, Holmes," I said at last. "The cleverest crimes are often undone by their own brilliance." Holmes gave a slight smile, his gaze fixed upon the fire. "It is the eternal folly of the criminal mind, Watson," he mused. "They believe that to deceive the world, one must vanish without a trace. But true deception lies not in disappearing, but in remaining unseen even in plain sight." I considered this. So, in the end, Cartwright's greatest mistake was not in what he did, but in what he assumed. "Precisely," Holmes replied. "He believed himself invisible, but even the most intricate illusion will collapse under the scrutiny of logic and observation." He took a long draw from his pipe, then exhaled slowly. "A ghost may pass unnoticed in the night, Watson, but sooner or later, someone will always notice the footprints." I leaned forward, my curiosity still lingering. "Holmes, in your mind, what was Cartwright's single greatest mistake?" Holmes gave me one of his knowing smiles, but said nothing, only tapping his fingers lightly against the arm of his chair. "So, dear reader, I turn the question to you. What do you think was the criminal's biggest mistake? Was it the overconfidence of a perfect plan, the choice of accomplices? Or was there a single clue he overlooked that sealed his fate? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I would be most curious to hear your deductions. If you enjoyed unravelling this mystery, subscribe for more Sherlock Holmes adventures, where we explore the greatest cases of deduction ever recorded. And if you know a fellow mystery lover, share this story with them. Perhaps they too have an eye for the unseen. Until our next case, dear readers, the game is always afoot.